Welcome to Energy Insights. Today we're speaking with Katrin Wu about supply chain decarbonisation in the technology sector. We cover topics like what supply chains include, Apple's decarbonisation strategy and its new commitments, how Microsoft and Samsung compare to Apple with supply chain decarbonisation commitments, the price of consumer goods during the energy transition, and many other topics. Katrin is a climate and energy campaigner at Greenpeace East Asia. She focuses on corporate energy transitions and the technology industry's supply chain. Currently, she leads Greenpeace East Asia's campaign that calls for technology company suppliers to transition to renewable energy. It was great getting Katrin on Energy Insights, and we hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, so we're rolling. Okay, so we are here with Katrin Wu. Katrin, thank you so much for coming on Energy Insights.
Thank you for inviting me.
So today I wanted to touch on supply chains and the issue about decarbonizing supply chains. But first, I think I wanted to just get a little bit about who you are and to give listeners an idea about your background and what you're working on.
Yeah. My name is Katrin, and I'm the campaigner from Greenpeace East Asia. So my current focus is on emission from the tech supply chain part, and also like the renewable energy transition for all tech suppliers. Yes. So that's basically what I'm focusing on right now.
How long have you been looking at the tech sector for?
I guess it's from 2021, and we started to focusing on the whole Asian tech tech industry going for renewable energy. But now, since most of the companies are on the track or like they have committed to 100% renewable energy, we have now started to looking at the whole supply chain part of the emission of the industry.
Awesome. So yeah, I mean, before we get into the details about decarbonizing supply chains, I think it might be worth going over what a supply chain is exactly. I mean, for most people, I think a supply chain is basically the product and how it gets to your door, for example. But there's obviously much more to a supply chain. So I was just wondering if you could give us a brief, description of what a supply chain actually has if you look at the details.
Sure. So I guess as consumers, when we receive the electronics products, we don't really think about how the products are made or like who made them. But the fact is, like most famous tech companies that we are very familiar with, for example, Apple or Microsoft, they don't usually make all the components of their products, or they don't manufacture any components at all. So they need to find some other companies to manufacture the parts or assemble them together. We can take iPhone as an example. So Apple doesn't have any manufacturing line. So Apple needs to find the best suppliers to, supply different parts for its products. In our case, iPhone. So such as chips, displays, wires, and also like batteries. And then when Apple gets all these parts, they need to look for some other companies some trustworthy suppliers to finally assemble them together. And this kind of like manufacturing process that Apple requires to make its products is actually supply chain.
Yeah, so there's a lot that goes on in there. And I think that supply chain decarbonization is, it's become a really big issue over the past few years. I think even if you go back just a few years, it wasn't really in the conversation, at least from a general perspective, but today it's become quite important. So I think from your perspective, why do you think that supply chain decarbonization has, grown in importance today compared to, even just a few years ago, maybe a decade if you go back?
Yes, definitely. I think Greenpeace started to looking at tech industry's emission, I guess like a decade ago. And in March, when I was in a conference, and there were some companies there, companies start to say, okay, so like 2023 is like the starting point for them to looking at supply chain emissions. So since, like we have already into this kind of like supply chain emission stage, and lots of like tech companies, they were like facing like the pressure to reduce their emissions like 10 years ago. And actually some of the companies that we know, like Apple, Google, they have, like pledged to achieve 100% renewable energy across their operations. And also in some cases, they have already achieved this goal like a few years in the past. And when these brands have made some progress and the society have been thinking and looking at their scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions, and also they discovered where the industry's emissions really are, and it's actually like the manufacturing process. And but like much less attention have been, like paid onto those like emissions coming from like electronics supply chain. So I think there is a statistic saying that over 70% of the electronics industry emission coming from its supply chain. And we also did a research into specific industry from those like supply chain parts. So we looked into like the semiconductor industry alone is actually projected to emit more than 80 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2030, which is more than twice Portugal's annual carbon emissions. So yes, so it's like a very, I guess, like forgettable part of like the industry's emission. But luckily, we are here and talking about this issue today.
Speaking about big companies, I think one company that I did want to talk about was Apple, for example. I mean, and now compared to a lot of companies, it seems that Apple is trying to make an effort to reduce their carbon footprint. I mean, I think just off the top of my head, some of the things they've done in the recent past is reducing their packaging size, for example, or sourcing all of their operations in their headquarters, electricity from renewable energy. But I think this year, Apple made a pretty big announcement recently about a few products. And I did want to talk about some of the issues and the unknowns behind that, but I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that announcement. What made it different?
Yes, I think it was in September or just like early October. They made a very creative video to, I guess, like demonstrate its progress on decarbonization this year. And the video actually showcased the Apple's decarbonization from, I guess, like few angles, including Apple's renewable energy transition, decarbonization efforts by its suppliers, and also material circularity, water conservation, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, so like, I guess like the video is only, like demonstrating its progress, but actually in last year, Apple announced that like by 2030, all of its products will be carbon neutral or like manufactured with renewable energy. And in the very recent video, the company announced that more than 300 of its suppliers had committed to manufacturing Apple's products by using renewable energy. And I guess like overall, it's like a very good initiative. And I think Apple's influence is huge and pushing its supply chain to decarbonize and also recognize the important role that renewable energy plays in supply chain decarbonization is very crucial today because lots of companies haven't even realized that. However, I guess like when we examine these top suppliers' decarbonization and also renewable energy transition progress, the result is actually very hard to see. And some of the very big suppliers are, I guess, like stay in the shadow of like Apple's announcement and also avoid to take their own responsibilities to reduce their own emissions. So in the result, they have very low renewable energy ratios at the present.
So, for example, like you mentioned, Apple had claimed that a lot of their suppliers are using renewable energy now. Is there any way to verify this? I mean, I'm just thinking about how complex some supply chains are and how difficult it must be to make sure that every single one is, using clean energy, and especially because a lot of them are located in different countries, for example. So there's like different, regulations and different rules from particular governments, for example. Is there any way to verify Apple's claims, or is there, some issues there?
Yes, I think in Apple's case, I guess it's not like an industry secret, and they're actually like publishing or like releasing this kind of like stories online as well. Like every Apple suppliers, they have their own Apple like manufacturing line. It's only for Apple. It's not for any other like companies. And within this like manufacturing line for Apple, they will have like specific, I guess, like measurement to measure like how much electricity that you have been made. And nowadays in the markets, company can purchase renewable energy from like, I guess, like different options. So for example, they can build their own, I guess, like renewable energy, a rooftop solar system at their facilities, or invest in like renewable energy plants, or like signing this kind of like power purchase agreements with other electricity producers. And also there are some easy options for them to purchase renewable energy, such as, I guess, like they're buying certificates. So it can be like showcasing, okay, so I have used this much amounts of like electricities, and it can be like offset by the certificates. So I guess like when Apple calculating how much renewable energies that their suppliers have been using, they can do it in like different ways and see like actually like certificates or like the evidence for them to from them to use renewable energies.
What about other tech companies? I mean, like Microsoft and Samsung come to mind. What are their decarbonization strategies looking like in their own supply chains? I mean, has there been any research suggesting that those other two big tech companies are going in the right direction, or are they not doing enough?
Yeah, so far we haven't seen, well, like these two companies have committed to 100% renewable energy in their own operations, but not across their supply chains like Apple has been doing so far. And like in Samsung's case, the company announced last year only, like it will achieve 100% renewable energy and also net zero by 2050. But I guess like the really key point is Samsung so far has not included its supply chain, its like net zero targets. And the transitioning timeline for the energy is also very far away. So I guess like for Samsung, it still has like a long way to go. And I guess like for Microsoft, I guess like Apple has set a pretty good like benchmark for all the tech companies, either in committed 100% renewable energy across its own supply chain. I think like Microsoft can do the same. And we actually expecting like all these big companies to do the same.
Now, mentioning Microsoft, it actually, I was thinking about a recent bit of news that I read about Microsoft, about their deal that they recently signed, paying for carbon removals from direct air capture, so like sucking carbon out of the air. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that, and do you think that this also could be an option for some tech companies to pursue in the future, or are there any problems with this kind of approach?
I think for us, we're looking at the most efficient way for company to decarbonize themselves, instead of, like going different direction or like putting new efforts. Of course, like these kind of like new technology will be good to have, but I think the most important thing is like we have to we have to like face climate change right now, and it's like urgency. Why not choosing the most effective, like methods such as like transitioning to renewable energy right away, instead of like you're spending more time and more resources into developing new technologies. So I think that's how our, I guess, like thoughts on this kind of like developing new technologies. Like we have to use the most effective way to decarbonize.
So bearing in mind everything that we've talked about, there's still an issue for companies, whether they're in tech or in other industries, and about how complex their supply chains are. And I think keeping track of all of these little suppliers is going to be really difficult work in the future. How do you think this could be made easier? I mean, do you have any ideas about any particular program that could make keeping track of these suppliers and what kind of energy they use, for example, a bit easier compared to what it is now?
Yeah, I think it is crucial that tech companies continue to track their supply chain emissions. And I guess the fundamental question comes down to whether suppliers will take more responsibility in, emission reduction and also increase their awareness of the important role that transitioning to renewable energy is. Because when we're talking about supply chain decarbonization, we're actually talking about other companies' responsibility, right? So if we're talking about Apple's supply chain emission reduction, we're talking about, it sounds like Apple's responsibility for somehow, because it's like a business relationship. But suppliers is also like an individual company. So if we're looking at top, 10 suppliers from Apple, we're looking at TSMC, Samsung Electronics, Luxshare position, and all these companies have gone public onto the stock markets. And they're all having billions of revenue on their own every year. So all these suppliers have to realize that supply chain decarbonization is not some other company's responsibility to keep reminding them decarbonize or transitioning to renewable energy. It's individual companies' efforts and also ambition level. They have to level up their ambition level and also speed up their energy transition progress. So I think if every company can take their own responsibilities, supply chain tracking progress will be much easier for other companies because everyone is working all together.
I think this also brings to mind the idea about, for me anyway, about circular economies. I mean, this concept has been around for a very long time, but lately it's been getting a little more attention. Do you think that circular economy models could potentially help as well in decarbonizing supply chains?
Yeah, I think this kind of model will definitely help supply chain decarbonization process. And I think there are some companies using, recycled materials to, manufacturing their electronics parts. And I think more companies need to put in efforts in using recycled materials and urge their suppliers to do so as well. But if we're looking at supply chain decarbonization in a more scientific way, we should evaluate, firstly evaluate companies' GHG emissions. What does that look like? So GHG protocol is the standard and also the guidance to measure companies' emissions. So it comes down to 3 scopes. So the scope 1 is actually the direct emission from companies owned and also controlled sources or energy. The scope 2 is actually the indirect emissions coming from companies purchased electricity. And the scope 3 are all the indirect emissions, so not included into the scope 2 that occurred in the company's value chain parts. So including both upstream and also downstream parts. So if we're looking at this kind of GHG emissions of a company, of a supply chain company, we could easily find out that most of where the most emissions coming from. So in the supply chain case, in the manufacturing company's case, most of companies' emission coming from their electricity consumption. So if we want to deal with this part, so like if we want to like reduce this part of emission, so it will be like over 60% of like companies' emission. We'll know like what kind of like emission reduction option that we want to choose, which is transitioning to renewable energy. So that's the easiest way to do so.
One thing that's a little, I think, a concern for a lot of people is when people talk about transitioning to, for example, like a clean supply chain from, and a transition always means going from something old to something new, right? So I think one thing that concerns people is cost. And does transitioning to a new supply chain mean that costs go up? And of course, that means consumers have to pay more as well, because the suppliers are kind of trying to figure out how to balance things. Do you think that cost is going to become an issue as more supply chains decarbonize?
I don't think it will be necessarily more expensive than others. For example, if we're looking at Apple's like carbon neutral watch, it's actually not more expensive than its like previous like watches. And we also need to understand that some of the approaches that like companies take, for example, like we just mentioned, transitioning to renewables, has become very mainstream, and the cost of like using renewable energies is actually cheap, and company can gain some like financial benefits from adopting a different sourcing strategy.
And what about consumers? Do you think that consumers have a role to play in all of this, or is this simply just a big issue for, say, governments and businesses to take on? Do you think consumers can play a role in trying to push companies to decarbonize supply chains?
Yes, I definitely think consumer has responsibility to do so, and actually like all stakeholders, like governments, tech companies, like suppliers, they all have like responsibilities to advocate for a greener, I guess, like tech product, and also like industries as well. And key stakeholders like tech brands and also their suppliers must, like level up their decarbonization ambitions and also progress in order to, align with our global climate agenda, for sure.
Yeah, and so being mindful of your time, Katrin, I just had one more question for you. So putting everything together, what are your thoughts on the current direction of supply chain decarbonization? Do you think that the globe is on the right track now? Do you think that things are moving quick enough, or do you think it needs to be, do you think more needs to be done?
I definitely think like more needs to be done, and like more company can join the force of like getting this industry cleaner and greener. And we will actually release a latest version of supply chain ranking on November 21st. So let's stay tuned. And I guess like the result I'm seeing so far is quite unexpected. So
when does that release come out? Sorry,
21st November. So like
21st of November. Okay. And is that looking at every big tech company or just a select few?
So we're looking at top manufacturing companies, so like suppliers, emission reduction progress, and its renewable energy transitioning progress. So yeah, it will be fun.
Awesome, Katrin. Well, thank you so much for taking out the time to talk with us today. Really appreciate it, and really looking forward to the report coming out.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
If you found this episode valuable, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, share it with your friends or colleagues, and visit our website at energytracker.asia for more. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time on Energy Insights.